I discovered that my power increased precisely when I stopped trying to be heard. Teruha showed me that true influence doesn't come from the tone of voice, but from the silence that reveals posture, intention, and self-control. And when I learned that, I realized that much of what I sought with words, I could achieve simply through my presence. Stay with me until the end, because I'm going to show you how the right silence can become the most powerful weapon in your mind. The day I realized I talked too much, I tried to explain, convince, justify, as if the world needed to understand every detail of what I felt, every nuance of my thinking, every reason behind every decision I made. It was compulsive, almost desperate. This need to be understood, to make people see my point of view, to prove that I was right or that my emotions were valid. I filled the air with words, so many words, as if quantity could compensate for the lack of impact they clearly had. In meetings, I was the person who spoke for 5 minutes when I could have said the same thing in 30 seconds. In discussions, I repeated the same argument in 10 different ways, thinking that eventually I would find the magic formulation that would make the other person finally understand. In moments of emotional tension, I exploded in endless explanatory monologues, dissecting my feelings in exhaustive detail that no one had asked to hear. What I didn't realize was that this constant verbal torrent came from a place of deep insecurity. I talked too much because I was afraid of not being heard, so I tried to guarantee through volume and repetition what should have come through clarity and presence. I talked too much because I didn't trust that my words had weight on their own, so I multiplied them, hoping that quantity would create quality. I talked too much because I couldn't stand the uncomfortable silence, the empty spaces in conversations where tension or uncertainty might exist. Each pause gave me anxiety, so I immediately filled it with more explanations, more justifications, more attempts to control how others perceived me. But what I was really doing was diluting any power my words might have, transforming communication into noise, the message into background noise that people learn to ignore. But the more I talked, the less impact I had. This inverse equation devastated me when I finally recognized it. I noticed people mentally switching off while I was still in the middle of my explanation. I saw glazed eyes, postures shifting to defensive or disinterested ones, people discreetly checking their cell phones while I continued speaking. And most painfully, I realized that when I finally finished my lengthy monologues, people rarely changed their minds, rarely felt more connected to me, rarely left with a deeper understanding. In fact, they often left more confused or irritated than if I had said much less. My excess of words wasn't building bridges, it was building walls. A verbal fatigue that pushed people away from me. And that's when I understood something that would completely change how I related to the world. Those who master themselves don't need to chase attention, they attract it. The people I admired most, those with a magnetic presence, who commanded respect without demanding it, who influenced without apparent effort, they all spoke little. Their words were measured, chosen, rare. And precisely because they were rare, they carried weight. When these people spoke, everyone leaned forward to listen because they knew it wouldn't be wasted on gossip or unnecessary explanations. They didn't chase attention through verbal volume. They attracted it through cultivated presence and strategic silence. And I realized I was doing the exact opposite, chasing attention through excessive words, which ironically guaranteed I would never truly receive it. It was in this moment of brutal clarity that I began to observe my own behavior with uncomfortable honesty. I started counting how many times I interrupted other people because I couldn't wait my turn to speak. I noticed how many times I repeated the same thing in a single conversation, only reformulated. I recognized how many of my words were truly necessary versus how many were just anxiety disguised as communication. And what I discovered was humbling. Perhaps 80% of what I said was completely unnecessary. It was noise created by insecurity, by a need for validation, by an inability to tolerate silence or to trust that I had value without constantly needing to prove it through verbal explanation. I had become the person everyone tolerated, but no one truly listened to. The person whose words had lost all power because there were so many of them that they became indistinguishable from background noise. And this realization, however painful, was also the first step towards something radically different: the transformative power of chosen silence. Silence as a weapon, not as weakness. I grew up believing that silence was submission, resignation, the response of those who had no voice or lacked the courage to use it. In my family, whoever spoke loudest won arguments. At school, whoever spoke the most caught the teacher's attention. At work, whoever spoke the most in meetings seemed more engaged, more intelligent, more valuable. Silence was associated with shyness, with being ignored, with being left behind while the loudest people moved forward. I saw silent women being interrupted, having their ideas stolen by more vocal people, being overlooked for promotions because they didn't sell themselves enough. So I internalized the belief that to survive, to thrive, to have any kind of power, I needed to be constantly speaking, constantly asserting myself, constantly proving my existence through verbal volume. Silence seemed dangerous, a vulnerability that would be exploited, a weakness that would be punished. But Teruha showed me that silence can be absolute dominion, supreme control, power in its most refined and devastating form. Teruha was a legendary geisha, known not for her eloquent words, but for her ability to control entire rooms through her silent presence. There were stories of negotiations where powerful men would talk for hours, arguing, threatening, persuading, and Teruha would simply sit in perfect silence, observing until they eventually exhausted themselves and agreed to what she wanted without her having said practically anything. Her silence was not passive, it was active, strategic, deafening in its intensity. It created a vacuum that other people felt compelled to fill, often revealing far more than they intended. Her silence was a mirror that reflected back to people their own discomfort, their own insecurity, their own fears. And in that mirror, they saw themselves clearly, often for the first time. Silence gave me something words never could: space to observe, to truly see what was happening, beyond the obvious surface. When I was constantly talking, I was so busy formulating my next argument, preparing my next response, defending my next position, that I couldn't really perceive the subtle dynamics happening around me. I missed facial micro-expressions that revealed deeper truths than words. I missed changes in tone of voice that signaled hidden emotions. I missed patterns of behavior that only became visible when you stopped adding your own noise to the situation. But when I started practicing intentional silence, when I closed my mouth and truly opened my eyes and ears, a whole universe of information revealed itself that had always been there, but that I had never accessed because I was too busy making noise. Silence also gave me space to analyze without the pressure of immediate response that my compulsion to speak created. Before, I reacted instantly to everything. Someone would say something provocative, and I was already responding before even fully processing what was said. Someone would criticize me, and I was already verbally defending myself before considering whether the criticism had merit. Someone would make an offer or request, and I was already saying yes or no before truly weighing the implications. But when I adopted silence as a practice, I created a precious buffer between stimulus and response. I could receive information, let it settle, analyze it from multiple angles, consider broader contexts before deciding whether and how to respond. This analytical space completely transformed the quality of my decisions and interactions. I was no longer reacting blindly, I was responding consciously. And in that silent space of observation and analysis, I recovered power I had squandered through excessive words. The power to choose my response instead of being a slave to automatic reactions. The power to see situations clearly instead of through the fog of my own constant narrative. The power to make other people feel deeply uncomfortable with my silence, to the point of revealing much more than they intended just to fill it. The power to be mysterious, unpredictable, impossible to read, instead of an open book that anyone could manipulate because I telegraphed every thought and feeling verbally. Teruha had understood centuries ago what I was only discovering now. Silence is not the absence of power. It is often its most concentrated and effective manifestation. It is the difference between a noisy river rushing over shallow stones and a deep, silent ocean that contains devastating force beneath its calm surface. And for the first time in my life, I was learning to be the ocean instead of the noisy stream. The inner game that defines the outer game. When I began to control my reactions, I realized something revolutionary that completely changed how I moved through the world. I controlled the entire situation without needing to control other people. Before, my approach was to obsessively try to manage the external environment, trying to make people change, trying to alter circumstances, trying to force specific outcomes through effort and verbal manipulation. It was exhausting and rarely worked because I was trying to control 1,000 external variables over which I had no real power. But when I shifted my focus to the only thing I could genuinely control, my own internal reactions, something magical happened. Suddenly, I had real power. Not the false power to make others bend to my will, but the authentic power to remain centered, balanced, untouchable, no matter what external chaos brought. I realized that most people are playing a completely different game than they think they are playing. They think they are playing the external game, who speaks most convincingly, who has the most resources, who makes the most impressive moves. But the real game, the one that determines who truly has power in any situation, is the internal game, who maintains their composure, who cannot be provoked. To lose their center, who remains in inner balance while everyone around them loses theirs. I started seeing this everywhere. In negotiations, the person who could maintain inner calm while the other became visibly agitated always won. In conflicts, whoever remained emotionally regulated while the other person went into reactive mode had all the advantage. In any human interaction, whoever had more control over their own internal state effectively controlled the entire dynamic. The world responds to my inner state in ways I didn't even realize before I started paying attention. When I entered a room anxious and unfocused, the people around me became more tense and suspicious. When I entered carrying poorly suppressed anger or frustration, even without saying anything, the atmosphere became heavy and defensive. But when I started doing the inner work of regulating myself before interacting, when I entered already centered, balanced, rooted in my own axis, it was as if I changed the emotional temperature of the entire room. People unconsciously relaxed. Difficult conversations became more productive. Potential conflicts dissolved before they even began. Not because I was doing something different externally, because my inner state was radiating a completely different frequency that others responded to without even consciously realizing it. If I achieve balance, I become a firm point amidst the chaos, an unshakable rock while waves of drama and reactivity crash around. Me without me budging an inch. This isn't insensitivity or coldness. It's strength cultivated through dedicated practice. It's like being the tranquil center of a hurricane where everything around may be spinning violently, but at my center, there is absolute peace. And the most fascinating thing is that this calm center has a gravitational effect on the people around me. They are drawn to it, seek refuge in it, unconsciously try to align themselves with it, because it offers relief from the chaos they themselves carry. I stopped being swept away by other people's emotional storms and became the safe haven where they could find stability. And this didn't come from any sophisticated external technique. It came purely from having done the inner work of stabilizing my own nervous system, regulating my own emotions, finding my own center, and learning to remain there. Silent strength always triumphs over loud strength in the long run. Loud strength is impressive in the short term. It draws attention, makes noise, appears powerful superficially. But it burns out quickly and doesn't last because it depends on constant external energy to sustain itself. Silent strength, the kind that comes from deep inner balance and self-control, is like water eroding stone. It's not dramatic, it's not flashy, but it's relentless and eventually completely transforms the landscape. People with loud strength explode, shout, threaten, make scenes, and may even win individual battles through intimidation. But people with silent strength, like Teruha and the master Geishas, win entire wars without ever raising their voices, simply by remaining so unbreakably centered that eventually everyone else aligns with them, because it's the path of least resistance. I've learned that true power isn't about dominating others. It's about mastering oneself so completely that external domination becomes unnecessary, because the world naturally rearranges itself around one's unwavering stability. Like metal responding to a magnet, I learned to speak only when it matters. Before, I would talk to fill the discomfort that silence created in me, as if each second of pause in the conversation was a threatening vacuum that needed to be immediately filled with anything, no matter what. Silence made me anxious, made me feel like I was failing socially, that the conversation was dying because of me, that I needed to do something, say something, anything, to keep the flow going. So I would chatter about nothing, comments about the weather, superficial observations about things around me, pointless stories, questions I didn't even really want to know the answer to. It was pure noise, automatic space filling, a nervous compulsion disguised as sociability. And the more I did this, the more I trained my brain that silence was dangerous and needed to be avoided at all costs, creating a vicious cycle where I became less and less able to tolerate natural pauses in communication. Now, I only speak when my silence has already said everything that needs to be said first. This complete reversal has transformed not only how I communicate, but how I am perceived and the impact I have. I've learned that silence communicates volume. It conveys confidence. It conveys that you don't need constant validation. It conveys that you are comfortable with yourself. It conveys mystery and depth. When someone asks a provocative question and I pause for 3, 4, 5 seconds before answering, or sometimes don't answer at all, that pause says, I'm not controlled by your agenda. I respond in my own timing. When someone shares something, and instead of immediately filling the space with my own story or opinion, I simply remain present in silence. That silence says, I genuinely listen to you. I'm not just waiting for my turn to speak. Silence has become my primary language, and words have become the occasional compliment I use only when they add something that silence alone cannot convey. Rare words gain weight in a way that abundant words never can. It's pure economics. The less of something there is, the more value each unit has. When I spoke constantly, my words were inflated. There were so many of them that each one individually was worth almost nothing. People learned to filter my constant verbal flow, paying half attention because they knew there would be 1,000 more words coming anyway. But when I started speaking rarely, when I began to value my words through intentional scarcity, something dramatic changed. People began to lean in when I spoke. Entire conversations paused when I opened my mouth because it wasn't frequent, so it must be important. My opinions began to carry more weight in meetings, not because they changed in quality, but because they were offered less frequently and therefore received with more attention. When I am silent, I select. This act of selection is an exercise of personal power that I had never experienced before. Every time I feel the urge to speak and consciously choose not to, I am exercising sovereignty over myself. I am saying, I control my mouth does not control me. I am practicing discernment. Does this really need to be said? Does it add value? Does it serve any purpose beyond relieving my momentary anxiety? Am I speaking because I have something important to communicate or because I cannot tolerate silence? This constant curation of my words has become a spiritual practice, a form of meditation in motion. And the selection process itself makes me more aware, more intentional, more present. Instead of being a person whose words gush unfiltered like water from an open tap, I have become someone whose words are distilled, each one chosen for maximum impact. And when I carefully select my words, when each word is intentional rather than automatic, I have an impact in ways I never could when I spoke freely. A well-chosen phrase, spoken at the right moment with the weight of silence behind. It can completely change a conversation, turn a negotiation around, end a conflict, open a heart. I learned from Teruha and the master Geishas that they could do more with 5 perfectly calibrated words than verbose orators did with 5,000 words. Not because their words were magical, but because they were rare, chosen, and came from a place of deep consideration rather than anxious reaction. And when I finally speak now, after long periods of silent listening and observation, my words carry authority, not because I am more intelligent or eloquent than before, but because I have demonstrated through my silence that I don't need words to validate my existence, which paradoxically means that when I choose to use them, they are received as rare gifts rather than common noise. My presence began to speak for me. I realized that it was my gaze, my body, my posture, my calmness that truly influenced the people around me, far more than any eloquent words I could articulate. When I finally stopped relying exclusively on verbal language and began paying attention to how I inhabited my body and my space, a whole world of nonverbal communication revealed itself. I began to notice how maintaining firm yet gentle eye contact conveyed confidence and presence in a way that 1,000 words of self-affirmation never could. I observed how keeping my spine straight and shoulders relaxed communicated silent dignity that unconsciously made people treat me with more respect. I realized that my slow, deep breathing created a field of calm around me that others could physically feel, calming tense situations without me needing to say a single reassuring word. My body had been speaking all this time, but I was so focused on my words that I had never learned its language or refined its message. Master Geishas deeply understood that presence is primary communication, older and more powerful than language. They spent years training not only what to say, but how to move, how to sit, how to hold a fan, how to tilt their head. Every micro detail of physical presence was cultivated with the same care a sculptor applies to marble. Not because they were superficial or performative, but because they recognized a fundamental truth. Humans are animals before they are verbal beings, and we respond to nonverbal cues at much deeper and more primal levels than we respond to words. You can say, "I am calm" with your voice, while your body is radiating tension through raised shoulders, clenched jaw, and shallow breathing, and people will believe the body, not the words. But when your whole body is aligned in a message of ingrained calm, when every cell is transmitting peace, you don't need to say anything for everyone around you to feel and respond to it. My presence was strengthened through specific practices I incorporated daily. I began each morning with 10 minutes of body awareness, sitting in silence, scanning each part of my body, releasing accumulated tension, grounding my energy through visualization. I practiced mindful walking, not hurried or careless, but with intention in each step, feeling my feet connecting with the ground, my spine lengthening towards the sky. I trained my face to rest in a neutral but open expression instead of the anxious or defensive expressions I unconsciously carried. I learned to occupy space without apologizing, not spreading out aggressively, but also not shrinking to appear smaller and less threatening as I had done my whole life. Each of these adjustments seemed small individually, but accumulated over months. They completely transformed how I was perceived and how I felt inhabiting my own body. When my presence is strengthened through these dedicated practices, my voice becomes optional in many situations where I previously felt it was absolutely necessary. I could enter a meeting and simply sit in a centered posture with mindful and calm demeanor, and my silent presence contributed more to the productive, dynamic than if I had spoken constantly. I could encounter someone in conflict with me, and instead of verbally defending myself, simply maintain my grounded presence, my gaze calm but firm. And often, the person would calm down on their own, disarmed by my refusal to enter the energetic battlefield they were trying to create. I could be in uncomfortable social situations and, instead of nervously chattering, simply be present with quiet dignity, and people gravitated toward me precisely because of this quality of stable presence amidst the social chaos. My physical voice became just one of many tools in my communication repertoire, no longer the only one or even the main one. And that is the true power that geishas knew intimately. Not needing to use force to be strong, not needing to make noise to be heard, not needing to fill every space with words to have an impact. It is the power of a mountain that doesn't need to announce its greatness. It simply is, and all who see it recognize its magnitude without it needing to say anything. It is the power of the ocean that doesn't need to explain its depth. You feel it simply by being near it. It is the power of a lit candle in a dark room that doesn't need to shout, "Look at me." Naturally, all eyes are drawn to its light. When I finally understood that cultivated presence is a more refined and sustainable form of power than vocal or physical force, everything changed. I stopped trying to prove my strength through noisy displays and began to simply be strong silently, letting my presence convey what 1,000 words never could. And I discovered that true strength is so silent that it is almost invisible until you try to move it and realize that it is absolutely unshakable. Silence as a final strategy. Today, I understand that silence is not the absence of something. It is not emptiness or lack or failure of communication. It is concentrated presence. It is fullness. It is the densest and most potent form of energy I can bring to any situation. Silence is not what remains when I have nothing to say. It is what I choose when I have everything to say, but recognize that words would dilute rather than concentrate my power. It is like the difference between vapor dispersed in the air and concentrated boiling water. The same element, but in radically different states of potency. For years, I confused silence with passivity, with being talked about instead of speaking, with being forgotten or ignored. But now I see clearly. The silence I consciously choose is the opposite of passivity. It is the most active action I can take, requiring more strength and discipline than any number of words. Silence is intention crystallized in its purest form. When I speak automatically, when words gush forth without conscious filter, there is little or no intention directing them. They are merely reactions, verbal habits, anxious filling of space. But when I choose silence, especially in moments where everyone expects me to speak, where social or emotional pressure is strongly pushing towards verbalization, that silence is saturated with intention. Every second I hold is a renewed choice, an active exercise of will, a strategic positioning on the invisible battlefield of interpersonal dynamics. Teruha taught me that intentional silence creates a gravitational field that forces other people to reveal their cards, to show their motivations, to fill the space with information they would never share if I were chattering. It's like fishing. You can't catch anything if you're constantly stirring the water with noise. You have to be perfectly still and wait for the fish to come to you. Silence is control in its highest expression. Not control over others, but supreme control over myself. Every moment I manage to resist the almost irresistible urge to speak, to explain, to justify, to fill the discomfort, is a victory of awareness over conditioning, of intention over impulse. It is as difficult as advanced meditation, demanding the same level of vigilant presence and constant discipline. My mouth wants to open automatically in 1,000 situations a day. When I am criticized and want to defend myself, when I am provoked and want to retaliate, when I am anxious and want to dissipate the tension with words, when I am bored and want stimulation through conversation. But every time I recognize the impulse and consciously choose not to follow it, every time I keep my lips sealed despite the we say, internal pressure screaming to open them. I strengthen the muscle of self-control in ways that radiate to all other areas of my life. If I can control my mouth, the most impulsive and socially conditioned organ I possess, I can control anything. Silence is a strategy, not just in negotiations or obvious conflicts, but in all human interaction. It's the strategy of making others feel uncomfortable enough with the void I've created that they fill it with truths they would normally hide. It's the strategy of appearing mysterious and therefore more interesting than if I revealed everything verbally. It's the strategy of forcing people to work harder for my attention and approval, because I don't freely distribute it through constant conversation. It's the strategy of observing patterns and dynamics that only become visible when you're not adding your own noise to the situation. Master Geisha used silence as strategically as chess masters use pauses. Each moment of non-movement was carefully calculated for maximum effect. They understood that in a world where everyone is constantly talking, the person who controls when and how they speak effectively controls the entire game. When I choose my silence, I choose my power in ways that were never available when I was a slave to verbal compulsion. I am no longer dragged into discussions that don't serve me. I am no longer manipulated through provocations that used to make me react verbally. I am no longer drained by exhausting social interactions where I wasted energy on unnecessary conversation. I am no longer misunderstood because I said too much and was misinterpreted. My silence has become my sovereign territory, my impregnable castle, my sacred space that I fiercely protect. And this is what Teruha always knew, what it took me decades to learn. Whoever masters silence masters themselves completely. And whoever masters themselves doesn't need to master anyone else, because they operate from such a profound level of power that external control becomes irrelevant, like a queen who doesn't need to shout orders because her mere silent presence is law. If you've recognized that your words are weakening you instead of strengthening you, don't stop here. Subscribe now. In the next videos, I'll show you the exact techniques that geishas used to transform silence into absolute power. Turn on notifications so you don't miss the next video. The 3 types of silence that command any room. Leave a comment. Which part of this video impacted you the most? Silence is your weapon. Now you know how to use it. See you in the next video. The transformation begins when you close your mouth and open your presence.